is ended. The Atari 8-bit podcast.
This is Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. I'm Kay Savitz. This is the second interview episode about Computers Expressway to Tomorrow. Computers Expressway to Tomorrow was a school assembly sponsored by Atari that played at hundreds of middle schools and high schools throughout the United States in 1983 and 1984. In the previous interview episode, I interviewed one of the show's presenters and the filmmaker. In this episode, I interview Rick Trow. Rick Trow was the president of Rick Trow Productions, the company that created the Computers Expressway to Tomorrow show, as well as more than 40 other school assemblies and other productions over the years. Mr. Trow also wrote the script for the 40-minute show, which combined two synchronized films with a live actor to teach computer basics to young people. This interview took place on June 5th, 2021.
When I got out of college, I was looking for a job that would get me away from New York City and in a place where I wasn't going to be working for a major corporation or something. I always had entrepreneurial instincts. And in college, I had been very active in theater and creative things. So a guy came to my college looking for somebody to come to work for him. He was an elderly gentleman, and he had a booking agency, and he booked talent into high schools. His company was called the School Assembly Service. Mm-hmm. And what the School Assembly Service was an organization that would buy blocks of time from various performers. People would come to us, and we would buy blocks of their time and sell it to high schools for assemblies. The first one I did was at the Rochester Philharmonic Orchestra. When in their off season, we would hire a quartet or a quintet and send them around to local schools in Rochester and in the area around Rochester, and the schools would pay us and we would pay them. Sometimes the contract was a percentage, and sometimes we would just buy out their time. But anyhow, so when I went to work for this guy, I went on the road to these different schools, selling these acts to the schools. And that's where this $80 you have thing came from, which is we would charge about $80 to $100 for each performance. And these people would do 1 or 2 performances a day. And as I went around to school selling this, and my territory was Western Pennsylvania and New England, and as I drove around from school to school and watched some of these things, I realized that there were very large audiences of kids that were being brought out of their classes into the auditorium to be captive students, captive audience. And I got the idea that somebody might want to pay for that. Instead of we selling it for the schools, could we get a sponsor? And my first thought was the sponsors would be people who would want to sponsor arts, music, arts, things like that. Mm-hmm. But then it seems to me that if I could deliver the audience, I knew that educators would accept commercial sponsorship if it was handled properly. And I thought I knew how to do that. So I had a friend at Kodak who got me a meeting with some Kodak people, and I presented the idea of doing a show that I would write and produce about photography, and that it would be a great way for Kodak to get into schools. And at the time, Kodak was photography. So if they promoted photography, they were promoting Kodak, because all film was sold by Kodak, all processing was by Kodak, all chemicals were by Kodak. So I sat down with some minor people at Kodak, and I tried to make this presentation to them, and they didn't buy it. And the reason they didn't buy it, I'm sure, was because they didn't trust I could produce the media, they didn't trust I could get it into the schools, which was perfectly understandable for them. But I was so sure this would work that I went back to them with, I thought, an offer they couldn't refuse. I told them I would, at my own expense, produce a small show. It wouldn't be the big one that I presented to them, multimedia and everything, but it would be a single slide projector with a single screen, and we'd take it out to the local schools, and we would see how it would work. And all they would have to pay me was a certain amount of money, which would be determined, for every school that would accept a package. And the package would be how to use photography in the classroom and how to start a photography club and other uses of photography as part of education. And if they would pay me X number of dollars, and boy, I try to remember for a couple of days what extra number of dollars was. I don't. It was probably not more than $100 or $200 at the most. For each school that required this package, I would do it all for free, and except for that fee, of course, and we would go from there to see if it would work. Well, I think they were embarrassed to say no, because I said I would take all the risk. Mm-hmm. So we did that, and it was a fabulous success. We ran it around the Finger Lakes area and Buffalo, and not too far from Rochester, where we were at the time, and it was a great success. So they said, okay, let's do it. And starting with the schools who knew me, it was no problem to get in for the test because they already knew that we brought good stuff to the schools. And the subject matter was easy to deliver in an educational and entertaining way. What we did was a brief history of photography, followed by great ideas for history, social studies, science. No one ever challenged it as being too commercial. And it went so well that Kodak, ended up being the first of 3 shows that we did for Kodak, each with increasing budgets and increasing reach, until we went national with it, and it was extremely successful. So that was our kickoff. That was the model. Of where I went. And that model involved the sponsor paying for a production. And it was never much because it was like the razor and the blades. I was more interested in getting it into the schools because I got paid for that. Mm-hmm. So the sponsor would pay for the production, and then they would pay a fee for every school we could deliver. I mean, that was the one thing that I kept in the model, was that we took the risk. So we got what we call like a hunting license. I mean, I'd go to Kodak and I'd say to them, how many schools are you willing to pay for if we do schools for $250 a school? Oh, and it's not schools, by the way. I keep saying schools, but it's performances. Some schools we did 2 or 3 performances in. $250 a performance. If that was the number, that might have been somewhere around that. And they'd say, well, we'll do $100,000. So we would divide that by 250, and we would guarantee that we would only charge for the schools we went to. And we wouldn't charge for hotels or motels or gas or snow days or anything else, just deliveries. So it became like a cost per thousand kind of thing. And it worked great. It worked terrific. So the next thing to do was to see if we could figure out ways to get other organizations or groups to follow that model, which we did.
And at that point, you could already claim truthfully that you had Kodak as a client, and who wouldn't want to follow that, right?
Perfect. That was it. Mm-hmm. And I never would have had any client, I don't think, if I hadn't given it away free, turns out it wasn't free. I made a lot of money on that tour. What seemed like a lot of money to me at the time. I mean, I was a one-man show, so it seemed like a lot of money to me. But nobody was going to let Rick Trow, a couple of years out of college, no media experience at all except in his imagination. And I had directed a couple of shows in college, and I had written the show, the original show in college. So that was really what I wanted to do. That's really what I was interested in doing. And so I kind of morphed the idea with the business that I had stumbled into, right out of college. But it wasn't really much of a business. It was a guy in his basement with 2 secretaries. And when I say his basement, I mean it was a cellar. I couldn't even stand up straight in it. I'm 6'1", and I had to keep on ducking pipes. But I came back from a trip once. I'm kind of doing this backwards. I came back from a trip once, and I presented this idea to this guy. His name was Howard Higgins. I presented this idea to him. I wrote it up in a very nice presentation, like if I was doing a college paper. And I presented it to him, and he looked at it, and as he looked at it, and he scratched his head, and he said to me, you know, Rick, you shouldn't use company letterhead to write stuff to me. And I thought, oh, he was this great idea. I was bursting all over the place with it, and he was concerned about the letterhead. But then he followed up and he said, you know, I've been in this business for too long, and I want to retire. So I'll tell you what, I'm going to give this business to you. It's yours. Take it away. All you have to do is pay me $100 a week as long as I live.
All right.
I said, oh, really? I said, really? Oh, okay, I'll do it. And actually, the business had no assets. The only asset the business had was its name in the schools. And it was only in schools that were in a small geographic area in terms of, compared to the United States. It was a very small geographic area. And so I took it. I took the deal. I put the files in the back of my car. I drove to Philadelphia, where I wanted to live for personal reasons. Rented a 2-room office on the top of a firehouse, which is its own crazy story, because every time I was on the phone, and it's a volunteer firehouse, and every time I was on the phone and the siren rang, I had to say, excuse me, and hang up, because the siren would just blow away my phone conversation. So I hired one lady and started trying to sell this thing to other people. But I'm doing this backwards, because this was before the Kodak show. And of course, at that time, I was still doing the paid shows. When I went to Philadelphia from Rochester, it was with the hope of doing the Kodak show, but I hadn't really sold it yet. I hadn't really done it yet. I had just proposed it, thinking that Howard Higgins was going to do it with me. Turns out he didn't. I ended up doing it myself from Philadelphia. It was a success, which I told you that. And then it went on to the next client was Aerospace Industries Association. They had something called the General Aviation Council, which was the group of aviation companies like Piper, Cessna, Lear, Beech, that did general aviation, which was, of course, not commercial aviation. I knew that they had some interest in reaching young people, because I was a pilot, and I used to get their newsletters and things. And their newsletters were talking about the future and young people in the future. So I made a proposal to them, and of course, because I had Kodak in my success story, at the time, Kodak was only doing their first show, not the free one, the first one they paid for. But Aerospace Industries did a show, and that was very successful. And the follow-up on that was when we went into a market, the first market we went into was Muncie, Indiana, and we did a couple of high school shows and invited the kids out to the local airport to learn a little bit about private flying. And we had drawings where kids would get free rides, just up around the airport and back down again. And the first weekend that we did that, I got a phone call. I was still in bed. I got a phone call in the morning from the general aviation operator, the fixed base operator at Muncie Airport, saying that he had like hundreds of kids there, hundreds. And he didn't consider that a success. He considered that a mess, because he wasn't prepared for it. I, on the other hand, thought it was a fabulous success. And there it went. And I think you know about the other shows we did, and your interest is in the Atari show. Mm-hmm. So we could go on to that, or we could talk about 10 or 15 others. So
yeah, let's talk about Atari. How did you end up getting Atari as a client?
Okay, by the time Atari came along, this thing was flying. We were doing thousands and thousands of shows for many different sponsors all over the country, and I can't remember exactly how I got connected with Atari. I can tell you that all of my shows, everything I ever did, I presented an idea. So somehow or other, I found myself in California presenting an idea to a committee at Atari, and Ray Trow was there, and he obviously was the big dog of the room. And I had put together this idea based on the fact that Atari was perceived in the schools. I'd done a little research so that I could present this to them. Atari was perceived by educators as a game company. They saw nothing specifically educational about Atari. On the other hand, Texas Instruments was just the opposite. Maybe it's part of their name, but they also had a crummy little computer that was competitive to Atari's. Neither one of them was very powerful, but the schools thought of Texas Instruments as being a sophisticated company, and Atari as being Pac-Man. Mm-hmm. So I presented that to them, and I presented them an idea for how they might be able to change that impression. And I gave them an outline of a show. And so here's some interesting things that happened at that meeting. The first thing that was interesting that happened is all of our shows, I try to have audience participation. Like in the Kodak show, in a couple of the Kodak shows, we actually made a movie on stage, mailed the film into Kodak. Kodak returned the film processed. A local Kodak rep would come in and show the film in classrooms or sometimes at a whole nother assembly. So they got two hits for their money. So I had this idea of doing live demonstrations using the Atari computer. And Ray Trow said, no way. He said, because we're afraid of malfunctions. And I remember when he said that, I was relieved, because I was afraid of malfunctions. I'm not going to tell a potential client that I'm afraid their equipment is going to fail. So that was one thing that was in the way of doing it. And the other thing he said was that, and this was a good thing, he said, if I do this, I want to do this in every school in the country. I said, you can't do it in every school in the country. I said, first thing that you don't have, there isn't enough people to do those tours. Secondly, a lot of schools don't have large enough auditoriums. Some schools have only 300 kids, and their auditoriums will seat 200 kids, and it's really a gymnasium, and your CPM is going to be ridiculous. So let me go back and give me a day, and I'll try to figure out solutions to these problems, and I'll come back to you. So I went back to my hotel room, and I got in touch with my people back in Philadelphia. And I said, got to do some fast research. How many shows can we do? How many schools have seating of at least 500, which I already knew a lot of this anyhow. And I went back to him the next day, and I presented to him the idea that there were, and I don't remember the exact number of schools, but whatever there were, we would divide them by 3 and do them in 3 years. And that was the only way we could possibly do it. And that every show we did would have an audience of at least 500. If it didn't have an audience of 500, they wouldn't have to pay for it. And we would, as I said, with Kodak and all my other shows, we would take all the risk. We would take the snow risk, the booking risk, everything. All they had to do is give us what we call a hunting license. That's what we used to call it, a hunting license, which is we will pay for $100,000 worth of shows in this period of time. And that's what you have to deliver, or we won't pay for them. And that was okay with me. So let's see, I have some calendar information here if you're interested in.
Sure.
I did find the only thing I have left from all of this is my calendars. I've saved all my calendars. So this meeting with Ray Trow and his posse was May 12th and 13th, 1982. And I came back on the 13th and presented the idea of using as a live demo a voice synthesizer. So we get some kids up on the stage, and this had turned out to be a much better idea than the first idea. From the audience, I'd get kids up, and I'd give them scripts and have them do we had a bad guy, and the bad guy's voice would sound like this, and I got a biggest football player that I could find, Big Moose, and I tweaked his voice so he was put a wig on his head and tweaked his voice he was the maiden in distress. It was hysterical. It was absolutely hysterical, and it worked fabulous. But that was the fun part of it. But the show was all about computing, and you have to remember that back then, at least in the schools, they didn't know anything about computers. I mean, they did in some of the, like in suburban Boston, they did, but they sure didn't in suburban Buffalo. So we started from the beginning. You know what a computer is, what it does. We demonstrated programming, simple programming. We demonstrated the things that computers are doing right now in industry. There's a guy named Harvey Dubner. Harvey Dubner created the Dubner visual effects machine, whatever it was used in television stations everywhere. And we went behind the scenes, and he did a little stuff for us. We had a lady, Suzanne Ciani, as I remember her name.
That's right.
Who did computer music, and we did a little thing with her. We did how the police use computers and how hospitals use computers, and we did some simple demonstrations. I mean, kids were amazed at things like spreadsheets. The spreadsheets were like unbelievable. Wow, look at that. Column A, row 6 times 5. That's a lot easier than what they were doing.
Sure.
So they loved it. They loved it. I'm jumping around in time here because I'm looking at my calendar here. So I said on the 12th and 13th, I did this presentation. And my calendar shows I was still in California with a conference call with NW Air, who was their agency, on the 14th. So that's the third day. And then I met with NW Air in New York on the 19th. I'm sure it was about this project. And the same afternoon went to my attorney, and we finalized the contract. I wrote the first draft of the script, May 17th to 19th. But of course, I had been thinking about it so long. I had done a lot of research just for the presentation. And then I have notes that I may have rewrites and pre-production notes on my calendar throughout June and July. I shot at the Atari camp in between August 17th and 20th. I was there 3 days. And that was a lot of the stuff about kids using computers. And then I have other shoot dates all through September. On September 23rd, Atari was here, and I think that was the start of the tour because it says focus groups. So I guess that they were there for the start of the tour for the focus groups. So I imagine the first tours went out in September of 1982. The contract was for 3 years. It was 2 years, and 1 year was an option. A third option. So it was supposed to go through the whole school year of 82, 83, and then 83, 84 school year, and then the option on 84, 85. Of course, it never went that far, but
sure.
That was what the agreement was for.
I would like to know definitively how long it actually went. Did it actually finish that second year? Because
no. That's a great story.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, yeah. Please tell me.
I was here I am on cloud 9. We got 9 tours running. They're great. They're going great. We're getting great letters, great responses. Atari's happy. We're happy. My phone rings, and it was about a year later. It was in the fall of 83. My phone rings, and on the phone is Atari's lawyer, who I knew because I had negotiated the deal with him. And he's saying, Rick, I got some bad news. We're out. I said, what do you mean? He said, we're out. We can't do this anymore. We're having financial troubles. I don't know what's going to happen to the company, but, we're out. Because, this was like hundreds of thousands of dollars a year for Atari.
Sure.
And also for me, it was the biggest client I had at the time, and I had stretched myself to be able to accommodate Ray Kassar's desire to play so many schools. I mean, in such a short time. There's more schools than we played with Kodak, in 5 or 6 years, and they wanted to play them in 1 year. Then I stretched it out to 2. And so I said, well, and not only that, but we booked 6 months to a year in advance. So I had hundreds of schools already booked for this show. And the reason they take it is because their neighboring schools say how great it is. I mean, that was the whole idea. We would take a show into a community, let's say into suburban Dallas, and we had friends there because we had schools that we had been performing in. So those schools would take it right away. We'd call them and we'd say hi. I had a whole bunch of telephone people who would call the schools, and each one had its own territory, so they'd call the principals they knew or the assembly directors they knew. And they would say, got a new show from Atari. And they'd say, I'll take it. They didn't even think twice. They didn't have to tell them what it was because they had had such success with our other stuff. And we'd run a tour through there and play maybe outside of Dallas 3 or 4 schools where they loved us, and get those schools to support us by writing letters about how great it was and talking to their friends. And then we'd come through with another wave and get every other school in Dallas, because now they didn't have to worry about what it was. They knew what it was from their peers who had it.
Mm-hmm. Ronnie still had hundreds of letters that she had received about like the show and how good it was. Yeah. So it was amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I have those. I actually found the loose leaves where I have hundreds of those letters from all these different tours. Didn't even know I had them anymore, but I guess I didn't throw those away. So I said to Jamie, who is this lawyer's first name, last name I don't remember, I said, Jamie, we've got hundreds of schools booked. I mean, you can't just walk away on this. And he said, well, we have to. There's nothing else we can do. And I said, you're going to kill my business. I mean, I was screaming. I was hurting. And he said, tough, he said, tough, that's what it's going to be. So I thought of a strategy, and I wrote a letter. And the letter was written to principal. I never mailed it, but I wrote a letter. And the letter, in effect, said that Atari had screwed me and was destroying my business, and I was not going to be able to visit schools anymore, and it was all going to be Atari's fault. And I sent it to Jamie. Mm-hmm. And I said to Jamie, I'm sending this letter to every school I'm canceling. I'm not going to say I'm sorry we can't come. I'm going to say we not only can't come, but we're going to go out of business because of these bastards. And Jamie comes back and says, you sent out, we're going to sue you to the moon. And I said, fine, there's nothing left of me anyhow, so sue me to the moon. I mean, what are you going to get? In the meanwhile, I knew they were negotiating with Commodore. I knew they were.
Right.
I don't know how I knew it. But I knew it. I was trying to remember the other day how I knew it, but I don't know how I knew it. And I said to him, you think this is going to be attractive when this comes out? I'm going to send a copy of this letter to Commodore. Let's see, maybe we can do something about this. So they came back to me and they agreed to do up to a certain date. Do not remember the date, but up to a certain date, but they were not going to finish even the second year. But they were going to do up to a certain date. Up to the date we had booked, which was probably sometime in the spring, that we had booked already. And so that's what we did. And we finished the tour up until then, and it was over.
The spring of 84, right?
Yeah. It would have been, yes, 82, right. 83 was the first. Let me look at my calendar. The first tour was 82, 83. So it would have been 83, 84.
Right.
The spring of 84 would have been, that would have been the end.
It makes perfect sense. And then in July of 84, Jack Trammell brought the company. It was a new, and he didn't spend money on anything, and he would have certainly killed it at that point. So
I don't even know if he knew it existed. I don't know. I mean, at that point, we weren't exactly having long conversations about Atari's future. I was scratching for life. Is what I was doing,
right?
Because I had at the most tours we had out at the same time might have been 15 or 20, I don't remember, sometimes maybe 20, but usually about 15. And I had 9 of them committed to Atari for 2 years. And I knew when I did that, that was dangerous. But how do you say no to a couple of $1 million, and the hottest company in the country. I mean, they were red hot, and it just didn't enter my mind that it wouldn't end well.
Sure.
It just didn't enter my mind. Except I did know that it was a risk, and so I took the risk, and it turned out it was, it wasn't that bad because by playing that much of the tour, and also they. See, I know you're going to get to this question, so I'll answer it before you get to it. The way we charge for this thing is there were three layers. First, the client would pay a cost to create the production and one touring unit. The production and one touring unit. And my recollection of the Atari is that might have been somewhere around $250,000, but it might have been $350,000. I couldn't tell you now, but I think it was about $250,000 because I was so hot to get them in the tent, because the real money was going to be made on those shows, not on the production. And since I was always overspent my production budgets anyhow, because I always knew that the better I could make the show, the more successful it would be and the longer it would survive. And then the second thing is, after they decided, okay, so if they quit after that, no one ever did, but if they quit after that, I was covered for my production and my first touring unit that went out to kind of prove that the show worked. And then they would give me this hunting license, and they would say, okay, we want to do 1,000 shows, or we want to do 400 shows, or we want to do 600 shows. And then I would figure out how many, I mean, I wasn't the only one. I had a company. We would figure out how many touring units we needed. It would have to do with where they wanted to go, because obviously if you were in a tightly packed place, you can get from one school to another in an hour or less. And if you're out in the boondocks, it was 2 or 3 hours. So we had to figure all that out, which we did, and off we'd go. So then we'd build the touring units. In the case of Atari, we built 9 touring units. I'm pretty sure it was 9 touring units. And they would pay us for each one of these touring units. And my recollection is it's somewhere around $15,000. A touring unit was a van, and with security, we had gates and everything inside the van, so even if you broke into the van, you couldn't get to our equipment, and projectors and screens and a sound system and yada, yada, yada. Everything, we was entirely self-contained, because even if we went into a school that had all kinds of modern equipment, we had to get in and get out. We couldn't fool around with figuring out their boards or their plugs or anything. So we brought all of our own stuff. And by the way, here's something interesting. We used to use these big theater speakers, and I had to rent these big vans to use these big speakers. Somewhere along the line, Bose came along. And I don't know how it happened, but we ended up with these little tiny Bose things that Bose gave us for free, these little speakers, and filled whole auditoriums with these little Bose speakers, which was great for Bose, and it was great for us because we didn't have to buy them. But that was what a touring unit was. And then they would give us a hunting license. So it would be, the production would be one price, and then the creation of the touring units would be the second level of money, and the third level of money would be per show. And I'm pretty sure that Atari paid us $300 a show. That number sticks in my mind. And a touring unit could do easily 10 shows a week, but we figured 9 when we did the averaging. We figured 9, but it was an easy 10. And we figured 26 weeks, which was half a year, because that gave room for holidays and, of course, summer we didn't tour, and snow days and things like that. And we were pretty close to 250. A good tour was 250 performances. So that would be 250 performances at $300 a performance would be our gross for a tour. It all sounds, when I was looking at it all sounds so small now. But remember, in those days, I remember we had a deal with Motel 6, I think it was, for $10 a night for our people who would stay for $10 a night at Motel 6. His gas was less than $1 a gallon. We were leasing vans for $250 or $300 a month. And I'm not talking about 3-year leases. I'm talking about one school year lease, 1 year lease for that kind of, the whole world was financially, the whole financial model would never work today. It would never work today because the cost per thousand for a sponsor would just be outrageous. And that's actually what killed it at the end. I mean, the end of my business, of this phase of my business, came when motels were $90 a night and $80 a night, and gas was $1.50 and $2 a gallon, and it just wasn't workable anymore. It just didn't make sense. The cost per thousand to a sponsor just got out of hand.
Sure.
And so there was this brief little moment in time from the middle 70s, maybe the early 70s, till maybe the mid 80s, when this was a great idea. And then it became an unworkable idea. And it died.
Yeah. Let's see. So $300 a show, 500 heads per show. So that's roughly 50 cents per head for a captive audience to learn about your product or service, plus overhead and stuff.
Yeah, well, in some cases they weren't that interested in the kids. Like in the case of Atari, yeah, they were interested in the kids, but what they really wanted to do, what the whole thing was geared to do, was Atari knew, and it was part of my presentation because we knew that all of these classrooms that had typewriters in them, schools in those days all had typing classes, were soon going to have computers instead of typewriters. And the idea was Atari was supposed to have, in concert with this tour, created a software hardware package to sell to schools to create what turned out to be computer labs. To create what turned out to be computer labs. So a school would buy, in this dream scenario, which never happened, and that's what I worked with NWA on, this dream scenario. What was going to happen was that Atari was going to put in, let's say, a classroom of 30 Atari computers, all loaded with all this great software they were going to create specifically for schools to teach computing. Well, it never got that far. So I don't know how far they got internally in getting that ready, but I never saw any of it.
The idea would be that you get the information in front of the principal or whoever at the school who has the buying power, and they have Atari on the brain, and then Atari would follow up with, hey, buy a lab full of computers, and maybe they would. And so that was the thought at one point. Yeah.
Exactly. And also remember, every show we did, and this is one of the reasons why it was successful. And I was the keeper of the watch on this. I was mandatory about this. There had to be a really strong educational component. Because if there wasn't a strong educational component, our booker, who is usually the school principal or vice principal, would be mobbed by his faculty after it was over. You mean you took our kids out of class for this commercial junk, this sell? Instead, they had to say after it was over, that was worth the time. Sure. And they had to thank the principal for doing it. So it had to be strong educational and very low-key sell.
Did you have
strong educational?
Mm-hmm. Quick tangent. Did you have competitors which were not as scrupulous as you about that? Because I remember a couple of assemblies I went to as a kid that had no educational component. They were just trying to get us to sell magazines and other stuff like that.
No, the thing is, the answer is yes. There was some of that, but when we were booking shows for $80 a pop, before I did the sponsor thing, one of my acts was a dog and pony act, and I mean it was a dog and pony act, dog and pony. That's not a
euphemism.
It was a dog and a pony act, and it went great because there were principals who would bring a dog and pony act in and pay for it and believe that it was good for school spirit. But,
sure.
So every school and every principal, fit a certain mold, depending upon how interested they were in education. And there were schools, even though we played, I think somewhere someone figured out we played over 10,000 schools. And although I'm not sure that I didn't count some schools twice, because that's a pretty big number, but they said over 10,000 schools. And there were schools that said no. They said, no, we can't take kids out of class to do the Atari show. But there were fewer and fewer of those as we go through a territory more than once, because we would get the track record of being a valuable educational thing. So every show, if you can name any sponsor I had, and I can give you the educational validity of the show, and I could show you responses and letters, if I had them all, which I don't, from school administrators thanking us and saying it was well worth the time. Like, for instance, we did a show for years for the ski industry. The idea of that show was it was hilarious. We took a bunch of city kids who had never skied before, had no ski clothes, who knew nothing about skiing, and we took them up to a ski mountain and just followed them documentary style as they tried to learn how to ski. Well, obviously you can imagine they were flopping all over the place and laughing hysterically at each other. And basically the idea of it was that it was an anti-drug program. It was how to get high without getting high, to be in the mountains, to be in the fresh air, to use your body, to feel good, to learn something new. And one of these kids was an athlete, and he ended up at the end, he was skiing a slalom course. This was only a week, and he was skiing a slalom. And a couple of these kids could get up on their skis, but had the time of their life, flopping around. And that was sponsored by National Ski Area Association and Ski Industries America, and co-sponsored it, and brought into the local area by ski areas who offered ski trips to the school. So after the show was over, if the school wanted to, and only if they wanted to, there was a way for them to do a ski trip for their students. Everything from the bus ride to the overnight stay to everything, all packaged up by the local ski area. And that worked for years and years. In fact, someone once estimated, I wish I had this number because it was a big number, that if every school we went to, if 3 kids became skiers because of this show, 3 kids became skiers, their lifetime value would be, with some huge amount of, because, they would get married, and this is what I think Burson Marsteller did this study, I'm not sure, that their wives and husbands and children were likely to ski too if they were skiers. And it was something like tens of thousands of dollars from every performance was going to accrue to the ski industry. So they kept on doing it until they didn't. Eventually everything stopped. But, so it just got too expensive.
Right. That makes sense. Do you have any idea how many students ultimately saw the Atari show?
I can only guess, and it's got to be over 1 million. But I can only guess. If you take your calculator and you go 9 shows a week times 9 units times, or a better way to do it is take 250 times 9, and that's how many would be in a year.
250.
250 times.
250 times 9 is 2250. 250 shows times 500 minimum students per thing. That's 1.125 million.
Yeah, and 500 is small.
Sure.
Because we went for the big schools, and plenty of them were 1,000, and 1,200, and 500 was just our minimum. That was our way to stay convenient. If we didn't have a 500 school minimum, we had to just only jump from big school to big school. We'd be on the road more. It was a way to make our jumps shorter. So yes, we wanted to go to the really big, and some schools we would do 2 shows, and each show would be 1,100 kids. That would be 2,200. But we did plenty of smaller shows too. So it's hard to tell.
Yeah.
It's hard to tell. I'm not sure I could have answered that question in 1984. I certainly can't answer it 40 years later.
Sure. Fair enough.
I don't know. But I know one thing. I know that the newspaper articles that were written about it in the computer press and everything constantly talked about millions of students, so I don't know. It would have been millions if it would have gone for the 2 years.
Right, 2 years, and that puts us at 2.25 million minimum.
Yeah.
So it's amazing.
No, I never just never went that far.
Right. Did you ever get any feedback from Atari if they were happy with it? Were they getting good feedback?
Oh, they were the people who I worked with at Atari were happy as can be. They couldn't have been happier. Whether they got anything out of it, I doubt, because I think they bailed out without doing their part.
Right.
But were they? How could they not be happy? You saw the letters. How could they not be happy?
Yeah.
I mean, if they had something to offer to the schools, we had the schools really ready to accept it, but they never offered anything. They never. I mean, like with Kodak, at least. There was a package, that said how to have how to start a photography club, how to have a school darkroom, how to turn a closet into a darkroom. There were a whole lot of things.
You sell something on the back end after the show.
How to use. In the show we did for the Department of Defense, it was about careers and different interesting careers and how to study for them and how to prepare for them, and then the payoff was at the end of the show was surprise. Every one of these careers that we showed you is available free of charge, training free of charge, experience free of charge in the armed forces. Not the Army, not the Navy, but just the armed forces, which is a way of soft keying it. And we left behind a little pamphlet that kind of gave the kids little quizzes about what they would be best in, what their interest would be and what they would be best in. And the last page of the pamphlet was a tear out where they could send it in, which said, in effect said, have a recruiter contact me with more information. And that worked fabulously. I mean, they did that for years. That worked fabulously. I mean, almost every follow-up we ever did on any show was a great success. The problem with the Atari show is there was never a follow-up. There was just the show. So there was never a follow-up.
So, okay, you already said it almost put you out of business, but didn't. So overall, was this project a success for you?
Yeah, yes and no. Yes, it was a success because Atari was hot, and I was able to use that story and show that show to the next few clients we got. So, I mean, I think the next client after that was the Department of Energy. We did a show we went to the Department of Energy with an idea that if they would do the first two parts, which was the cost of the production and the cost of the touring units, we would take the responsibility of selling it to power companies. And I remember distinctly that we took them to see the Atari show, and that was what sold them. That's what sold them. And then we did that, and we did a show on energy. And we sent it to power companies around the country.
Do you think there's any chance that anyone in the world still has the script or a copy of this film?
Boy, I would only be one of the performers.
So 9 people.
I wish I could give you stuff, like scripts and stuff. I just don't have it.
Oh, I want it so bad. But
I know. Well, there have to be 50 actors out there. I mean, some of them might have scripts. So if they hear this, some of them might be able to give you one.
Yeah.
I remember when I threw them away. It was the last move I made. I had been moving these scripts and these film cases. I mean, probably 200 pounds, 300 pounds of that kind of crap. I was moving from place to place as I kept on moving from house to house, smaller house, down in Florida, up here. And finally I said, who needs this stuff? And I'm never going to look at it again. So I threw it all in a dumpster and wiped a tear in my eye and said, that's over. Never expecting to hear from Kay. Never expecting that I would need it. I mean, no one's ever asked. No one's ever cared. You're the first person who's even mentioned it since it's over. And let me tell you how little I remember the performers. I vaguely remember Ronnie. I don't remember some of the other people you mentioned at all. But you got to remember, I'm going to be 82 years old, and I haven't been doing this for 40 years. And there were a lot of people I mean, there were a lot of people. We probably over the years had 50, maybe more, actors going out with these tours. It's hard to remember them.
Sure.
It's really, I could remember some that were for bad reasons, you know. So you asked about interesting stories on tour. So I thought about, what were they? Okay, so I had one guy who hocked his equipment. He went to a pawn shop and hocked all our equipment and disappeared. So I remember him.
I bet you do.
I have another guy. I sure do. I have another guy who, our pay scale, we were always afraid that people would get bored or unhappy and quit on the road, and that would be horrible. I mean, imagine somebody with dozens of shows to do in a geographic area who just simply said, I quit. I left the van at the airport and I flew home. So we would pay very small parts of their salary. We pay their expenses, but very small parts of their salary up front. And at the end of the tour, we'd give them one big check. Well, a lot of them liked that, but it was our safety, you know, that they were accruing salary, and if they quit, they wouldn't get it. So I had one guy shows up in my office one day in the middle of a tour and said he's quitting. He's got something else. He's got a chance to get a role on Broadway or something, or off Broadway, and he wanted his money. And I said, no, you don't get your money because you didn't finish the tour. Now we have the expense of canceling the shows. Of course, remember, we don't get paid for the shows if we don't do them. Canceling the shows, finding someone else to take the tour. And while I'm saying this, he pulled out a gun and he pointed it at me. Mm-hmm. And he said, I'd like my check, please. I'm looking down the barrel of this gun. Mm-hmm. I pick up the phone. I call my bookkeeper. I say, Ann, would you please prepare a check for Mr. Jones or whatever his name was? And he did. He walked out of there with a check. Now, here's the best part of the story. A month later, I get a call from somebody at the New York City Police Department for a reference for this guy. He had applied to be a police officer. I mean, I couldn't make this up. I couldn't make this up. And so I told him, I said, I think he'd be a great police officer because I've seen him wield a gun. And I told him the story. And then I thought, should I have done that? Maybe he's going to come visit me again. But he never did.
Holy cow. My goodness.
And I thought of another story. I never even realized this was a risk. But one of my actors fell in love with a teenage girl in 5 minutes.
Oh, no.
And took her. Took her. She got in the van with him and left.
Jeez. I'm sure that worked out well for everybody.
Well, I guess so. I mean, I had to deal with the police. I had to deal with her parents. I had to deal with the school. Eventually, I guess she was returned. I can't remember how it ended up, but I sure remember how it started. I remember how it started. It was a call from the local police. And, you know, there are no cell phones. There's no internet. This guy's running around the country
right.
with a 16-year-old girl that he kidnapped from a school. Obviously, he wasn't going to stay with us very long after that. So I had the hassle of replacing him and replacing the tour. With so many vans on the road and so many people, there was a reasonable amount of accidents and, you know, and that, unfortunately, one death. One gal who was doing a short tour for me got into a head-on crash and was killed.
Oh, no.
But for all the hundreds of thousands of miles we went, these kids did, and they were all kids. Now, I don't think anyone ever did a tour for me who was more than 25 years old, and a lot of them weren't more than 22 years old. They did a great job. They went out there by themselves, especially the women. I mean, I couldn't believe that women would want to do this, but they did it, and they did it well. And I'm grateful. I'm grateful to this day for all those people. I don't think it would work today. First thing, I wouldn't be so dumb as to take the legal risk. The legal risk of someone kidnapping a girl or somebody hurting someone in a school, or, you know, you didn't think of those things in those days. You know, or I didn't think of those things in those days. I was just too busy trying to to do my thing than to worry about what's going to happen if some 22-year-old guy grabs a 16-year-old girl and heads off into the sunset.
Right, yeah.
One of our tours, and this was a very successful tour, we did a show called The History of Rock. We did a couple of shows about music and rock. But this History of Rock was sponsored by local radio stations. And I don't know what market you're in, but I guarantee you that, where are you? Where do you live?
Near Portland, Oregon.
Well, I can guarantee you if I had the paper, I could find the Portland radio station, because there wasn't a market in the country that didn't do this. We'd go to the radio station and we'd offer them to be the sponsor of the show in their community. And to be the sponsor of the show in their community, the disc jockey would be able to come on the stage, their number one disc jockey, at the end of the show and offer a dedication hour to the students. So they would come on the stage, they would say, the kids would scream because he was a famous guy, and he would say, tonight I'm going to do a dedication hour specifically for your school. So write down your name and the song you want to hear. And when I'm on the air, I'll say, for Jimmy, we're playing such and such a song. Or they would do some school news or something just to associate them with the school. So I get a call once. They did a school. It was in New Jersey. It was a Catholic school. The guy comes on the air, and he says, let's say it was called Trinity High School, which I'm sure it wasn't. And he would say, hey, everybody out at Trinity High School, we were out there today, and we're here now staying high with the students and the nuns from Trinity High School. And boy, did I get heat about that one. Staying high in 1980, this might have been 1970 something, was not the thing to say. No, it's not the thing to say.
Right. Especially for religious school.
That was in my notes. I remember that.
So you said you're 82 years old. What do you do these days?
I told you a little bit about the career show.
Yeah.
And I thought that was such a great idea that when I stopped doing this, I created a company called The Career Game. And I started to produce media to help kids pick careers. And right now I'm just kind of cruising on that. In other words, that's had a lot of legs. I'm selling to this day, thousands of books called The Career Game. I have a website if you want to look at it. It explains it all.
All right.
Go to www.careergame.com. One word, careergame.com. It'll explain everything. And I play golf, and I live in Philadelphia for half the year and in Florida for half the year. And I service hundreds, maybe thousands of schools with these. I have an internet program, and I have books, and I have videos, all about how to help kids pick careers. And the whole idea was an offshoot of the Career Game show that we did for many years. I just took that idea and turned it into a different media.
Nice.
And that's kind of my annuity, and that goes on, and I do it myself, no help, all by myself, and it's doing great.
Awesome.
It's doing great. I've sold millions of these things over the years. I started selling them during the same period of time that I was doing the assemblies. The way it happened was that when the Army show was out, I had this little pamphlet I told you that I'd leave behind for the kids to kind of follow up on the ideas of the assembly. And when the Army show ended, I kept on getting requests from schools saying, do you have any more of these? Do you have any more of these? Of course, they were getting them for free, so and I didn't have any more because they were part of the show. But after I got enough requests, I decided, hey, maybe I can create something and sell it kind of on the side as another revenue source. So I did, and when the assemblies stopped, I just pumped that. I just made more products and better products for the Career Game. And the more I did that, the more I realized I didn't need 54 employees, and I didn't need a 10,000 square foot facility, and all I needed was myself. And if I needed something designed, I'd hire a designer. I didn't have to have a designer on my staff. And if I needed something printed, I'd hire a printer, and that's kind of what I did.
Nice. I think this is my last question. If you could send a message to the kids who saw the Atari show, and now they're adults, of course, perhaps listening to this interview, what would you tell them?
I would like to ask them what they're thinking now about that. Do they remember it? Did they remember seeing it? Did it affect them in any way? I'm more interested in what they'd have to tell me. I haven't got much to tell them. I just want to know what they'd want to tell me.
Fair enough. Thank you, Rick.
You're welcome.
If you enjoy these interviews and would like to contribute, make a tax-deductible contribution to the Internet Archive, a nonprofit digital library that has done incredible things to preserve computer history. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate. Thanks.